Bryant Vernon, the Chief Claims Officer for Aviva Canada. Thank you for joining us for a conversation today.
It's good to be here. Thank you very much, Brian.
It's always good to get to connect with you and hear what's going on up north. I do want to hear a little bit. Like we're in this interesting moment. Lots of companies are starting to talk about what they're going to do, return to work, new ways of working, and it's not just about our own employees. It's also our customers, claimants, whether they're our policyholders or third parties. People will be in different contexts quite often than they have been, certainly for the past year and a half.
hmm
Um, what do we need to consider as we go into the second half of 2021 with those shifts going on? So you think about claim delivery, the context we're going to be in, driving habits, all that sort of thing. What are the kinds of things, not to worry you with it, but what are the kinds of
Yeah,
things that are on your mind right now as we face this change?
sure. When I think about uh, our employees, I think about safety. So, in terms of post-pandemic, making sure that the environment is safe for folks to go back to, and that's something that we take very seriously. When we think about customers, there is shifting demand. We're seeing a lot more demand for virtual capabilities, so digital capabilities. That's not always easy because we don't have, and I'm sure many carriers are in different places in terms of their digital offerings. But we're definitely seeing an increased appetite for digital offerings. Um, when it comes to the business, it's really about we're such a operationally intensive, supply chain intensive part of the business, and we've seen some disruptions in the supply chain. I think if you've been tracking lumber prices, they've been crazy, as an example.
I heard
Uh,
there's hope that they may drop at least a little bit, but
they've
they have a
started to
long
drop.
way to go.
Yeah, there's been a bit of a, I guess, a sell off. I think there's some activity, uh, speculative activity, right, that
Yeah.
drove pricing up a bit. But it seems that there's been a bit of a sell off recently, so we're starting to see those pressures subside. But I think the impact of the supply chain is real. I think lumber was just a crazy outlier to some degree in terms of its pricing. But we've seen supply chain disruptions on the property side as well as on the auto side. And that has implications across the board. How long it's going to take for that to normalize, I don't really know, but it's something that you should be certainly keeping an eye on, working with your vendors to understand uh, what it means for them, and how do you work with them in order to address the situation. I think it's when it comes to inflation, which is the way it usually shows up in
Yeah.
increased pricing, just because supply just can't keep up with demand. It's very hard to do anything about inflation in the moment, and you just have to ride it out. And every company is going to figure out how do they manage those costs on a go forward basis. I'm thinking it's going to be a bit of a bubble, though. I don't think this is going to be a long term thing at this point in time, but I do think it's going to take probably a year or two for things to work out as just as we get back to normal, right? I mean, some of the issues have to do with obviously the pandemic and just having a shortage of folks who can move the inventory, produce the inventory. Some of it also has to do with just shipping and issues with shipping and getting things moved around the world. But I think it's a bubble, and I think we'll be able to. We'll just have to ride it out, and I think it's probably going to be a year or two of that. But I'm not an economist, or certainly I don't work in the futures uh, in terms of financials. But from the conversations I've had with folks in the industry, that's what most people are seeing.
Yeah.
It's going to be something of a year or so bubble for the supply chain, particularly on the auto side, to work itself out.
Yeah, of course, chip shortage is almost front page news constantly
Yeah,
right
chip
now. So,
shortage is the front page news.
right.
I think some of that, once again, it's hard to determine the extent of that, whether it's pandemic related or whether it's something that's deeper. I haven't heard that it's something that's deeper. I've heard it's mostly been about like routing of material and getting things to places versus a inherent shortage of fundamental supplies,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And we've seen, if anyone's following the news there, is the moves have been taken to right the ship but it's a long lead time. You have to get the fabs ramped up, and like
Yeah.
all these supply chain points is things are already in motion to correct it, but they could be 6, 12, 18-month lead times until all the pieces are in place and supplies flowing again. So I think you're right. Whether it's 1 year, 2 years, or 18 months or whatever, no one's holding you to that. But I think the point is very valid. There's a disruption. It still is playing out. Even if everyone is fully returned, we still have to see the supply chain sort of even out.
Yeah, I think Amazon and companies like that have spoiled us in thinking, everything can get you in 2 days.
Right.
The supply chain for manufacturing, unfortunately, doesn't have an Amazon equivalent. And things do take time to work out. I did a bit of research and studying system dynamics uh, way back in the day. And that's one of the things you're really focusing on is the flow of material or information. And one of the essential components of that are delays, like you said, because there are lead times to things.
Yeah.
And it's hard for us to like mentally model that out, like what that impact is gonna be. Um, but we're going to see it in the way that you mentioned. It's probably going to be 12, 18 months just to work out those kinks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've sort of gotten into this already, but I think the door's open on operations as a key part of claims. Is what is the role of operations in claims, and has it come even more to the forefront because all of a sudden, or perhaps we've been spoiled for a while, supply chain was front and center in everyone's minds. It's not just about, did the call come in smoothly and we routed it to the right adjuster and they handled it, and what's the the cycle time and the claim, but the broader sort of vendor management side of it. Is that what you think of when you think of operations and claims, or why is it such a critical thing, especially right now?
Well, I think claims, it's an operationally intensive part of the business. There are a lot of activities happen. People are doing work. It's very similar in some ways to a manufacturing facility, except we don't produce tangible goods at the end of our work. We produce a claim, right? And I think operations is extremely important. It's often overlooked. When I've seen that be the case probably in every single carrier that I've worked with, either that I've worked for or that I've consulted with. I think companies are very good about strategy. They're very good about the technical aspects of claims, but when it
Yeah.
comes to the operations, I think everybody has a long way to go. My experience with operations has been both bit from a business perspective, but also from an academic perspective. And I've studied it a bit during my undergrad and as well as my time in graduate school. And we're not scientific enough. Like we don't conceptually, we don't have the right mental models when we're thinking about operations. And I think we do a light touch. I know that at Aviva, we did systems thinking, which is very conceptual, which is
Yeah.
thinking about how does work flow, what are the steps. Um, but there's a lot of math there that needs to be done
Yeah.
that people don't typically do. And it doesn't have to be complicated math. It's just starting off thinking about what math is relevant to operations. And operations is really about friction and flow. So friction are things that slow the rate of work down, and flow is just the rate at which something can, the speed at which it can move at. When we were talking before about delays, that's really about the flow, and sometimes
Yeah.
it's the flow of a physical good, right? Like getting a car someplace, right? But sometimes it's the flow of information, like being able to connect and get information from somebody because you need that information. Maybe it's a permission, or maybe it's more detail about the accident before you can move something forward. So that thing you're manufacturing, that claim, can get stuck if you don't have a good flow of information. You don't have a good flow of the materials, like whether it's for building a house or for it's repairing a car. Um, I think people usually just take that for granted, and a lot of
Yeah.
times we see folks who don't have a lot of operational experience in leadership positions. Now that's not inherently bad, but if they can't provide good guidance around operational design, they may make fairly silly mistakes along the way that actually make the process longer or make it
Hmm.
worse.
Hmm.
I think it's really important for companies to keep that in mind, and ideally, either they have someone that they work with externally, or they have somebody on their own team who's really solid around operational design, operational flow on the team, who helps them think through some of the implications of the operational design decisions that they're making. But I think it's an absolutely critical component of it. When I think about a business that is operationally intensive, I always think about strategy, the technical capabilities, and the operational capabilities.
Yeah. And obviously Aviva has a lot of the lines of business that people would think, well, sure, operations is critical there. You're talking about auto, you're talking about home, the sort of main street coverages. I have a specialty lines background, and I know a lot of people who just presume, well, we're talking about litigated matters and everyone's an attorney, and so operations isn't relevant. Beg to differ. It's actually still, there's still a claim that's moving through a process, and it gets hung up, and there are things that you're waiting on, and dependencies, and flow is and friction critical regardless of the line of business.
It's true, and I think and you can get really mathy on this, and you
Yeah.
can get people who do linear programming and stuff like that, and I do think there's a ton of value there. But you can start with very simple metrics. You can
Right.
look at I've been talking with folks on the sales side as well, and I'm just asking questions like, well, how much premium per person per month? Because that's a measure of flow, right?
Yeah.
And what are the, like, how many of this type of activities are you doing per month? And so it doesn't have to be very complicated.
Right.
And once again, you're not looking at a number to judge, you're looking at a number to understand. You're looking at for variance and seeing, okay, where do we see that type of production really high? Where do we see it really low? Is there a good explanation for that difference or not? Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes a good explanation is, this is very complex and this is very simple. So you think the
Right.
simple stuff is going to flow faster than the complex stuff. But you need to start somewhere. And I'd say start with fairly simple metrics like that, just so you start to develop a little bit of an intuition of what, I guess, normal looks like in your operation. And then you can build off of that. You can start to do tests to see, okay, well, if I take something off someone's plate, because they're doing work they shouldn't be doing, right? And I try to maximize the utilization around work that they're most suited to do, right? Can we see a bump up in their throughput if we do that? Like, that's just one example. And I think I think of underwriters, and I know because which has nothing obviously to do with claims. I mean, we always will be the recipient or the beneficiary, I guess, of underwriting decisions and actions. But even underwriters, like, what work are they doing, and are they doing the right work? And if your goal is to grow top line, right, you probably should have them focus primarily on new business versus something else, endorsements or what have you.
Yeah.
And so it's really thinking about that flow and what work they're doing. And the same thing for us. We have technical specialists. How are we using those technical specialists, and are we getting the most out of them from a claims perspective?
Yeah. Bryant, you used a word before that I want to ask about. You said overlooked. You're talking about operations being overlooked. Claims is often something that's overlooked, or it's thought of as an after fact. It's the result of everything else that you're doing that's so critical in the market. Can claims be a competitive advantage, and have we seen things in the in the recent history that show us how and why that is the case?
I think claims can be a competitive advantage, but you've got to be really good, right? I don't think you can be slightly above average and have it be a competitive advantage. I think you really need to excel. You really need to stand out in the market. And for me, the way that we're looking at it, it's we think speed is absolutely critical, and that partnered with the ease of interaction. And those two things, I think, are absolutely critical. And if you can be extremely expedient, but also accurate and deliver it with a really good experience, right, around it, I think you can stand out in the market. I certainly know in Canada we're heavily broker intermediated, and I know that we're hearing from our broker partners that it is something that will distinguish you, right? Because if you're really hard to work with, then
It's more work for the broker. They're going to
it's
have to
more work
step
for the
in.
broker,
Yeah.
right? Because they're going to get pulled in. And I know, a number of brokers like being involved when it's necessary, right? But they don't want it to be necessary all the time, right?
Right.
So it can certainly be something that distinguishes you in a bad way. And I think if you're really good, then it can also distinguish you in a very positive way as
Yeah.
well. Also from a cost perspective, if you're very good at managing the costs and you can do that while also delivering an excellent experience, that also helps you be more competitive, which is another, to me, which is another form of a competitive advantage.
Yeah. Brian, I want to switch gears slightly. That you and I have talked about this a little bit before, data in claims, and I know that was an initiative you had to get your team more data ready, comfortable with it, using it, and savvy around it. What is the relationship with data and claims? How do you think that data impacts the way that we handle claims and the outcomes? And I mean, some of the differentiators that you just mentioned that can help a claims organization be, a standout that ends up giving that carrier a competitive advantage.
I often say I don't know how to run an operation, especially a claims operation, without data. I am not very much, I certainly believe in intuition that you earn over time by looking at data and like internalizing it and processing it. Um, I think it's much harder, not impossible, much harder to do that in the absence of data. It also makes it very hard to have good conversations, meaty conversations around what you should be focusing on.
Hmm.
Because if you don't have the data to help you understand where your areas of opportunity are, it's probably more guesswork, right, than
Yeah.
it is uh, science work. It's also, for me, it's been as much of a journey around culture and perception as it has been about the the numbers and the math. Because as people have been exposed to data, operational data, financial data, we've talked about it more. We've pushed data all the way down to our customer facing folks. Uh, they've become much more comfortable with it, right? It's also, I think, made it much more natural to introduce tools that are based off the data, right? Decision support tools, automation tools, things like that. And it's also pushed down accountability and decision making. And I think that's really, really important, because if people feel empowered to make decisions, and I was talking about speed, you want to make decisions as close to the work as you possibly can.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of carriers pull that back though. Like they have decision panels, they have escalation paths and things like that. Some of it has to do with controls, but I think a lot of it has to do with a lack of trust, with
Hmm.
with the thought that we can't trust certain people, right, at a certain level, what have you, with making a decision.
Yeah.
I think if you give people data and you help them understand how do you use this data to make decisions, it's very easy to trust people because they know how to check themselves. They know how they're going to be held accountable. They know how they're going to be assessed, right? They understand the logic of how we make decisions, and therefore they can replicate that logic themselves.
Yeah.
That's very healthy, I think, for an organization. I think it's one of the main benefits of introducing and using data. And it's really important, not, as I said, I think many times before, not to use data as a stick, but to
Yep.
use it as a diagnostic tool, to talk about it in that way. When you see a number that doesn't look right, you don't ask somebody why they're not good, or you don't tell them to make their number better. You go in and you get the context of it, right? And you
Right.
understand what is the context around the numbers that we're seeing, and you have conversations around the context. I think that gets people into the mindset of, oh, this is about having a conversation. This is about understanding. This is about learning. This is not about judging or assessing, right? Or mindlessly driving uh, something forward.
Right. You use that word understanding. I mean, that's kind of at the heart of the whole point of it. And then what do you build from there, and how do you operate from there? Back to the operations term.
Yeah, and what I found to be absolutely refreshing, because when I first started this journey, people question like, why do we have to do this? Why do we need all this information?
Right.
Um, and I remember giving a couple of examples, but also saying, but I also don't know. I don't know what I don't know yet, right?
Yeah.
But I know if people have data and if they have tools to help them understand the data, people will get creative, right? Because they are feeling whatever pressures in their local environment, with their the specific type of work they're focused on. They'll figure out how to use data to make themselves better, to make their operations better. And that's exactly what's happened here. I could never have architected all the stuff that I see at Aviva, like on my own, right?
Yeah.
At the very beginning. But quite organically, it's happened. And people have used the data to help them better understand their operations and creating, we use Click. A lot of the operational stuff we do is through visualization and drilling down into data. There's certainly a lot more you can do with it in terms of automation and decision support tools and stuff like that. But practically speaking, the fastest benefit you're going to see is just people being able to see it and dig into it, right?
Yeah.
Before you start using it for any more of the advanced stuff. And people have been very creative with it. They've built out apps that help them understand the flow of the work. It's helped them identify, oh, work is getting stuck right here, right? Because we know that it takes this amount of time for us to receive it. And then for the stuff that we do, we've compressed that, right? Because we use the data to help us understand what we have control over. But now we recognize we have to work with this other team that does stuff before we do it because they're kind of slow, right? And can we help them understand what's going on in their operations? Can we bring this information, this data, to have a conversation with them to help them improve?
Yeah.
That would never happen in the absence of data because people just wouldn't know, right? That like the lead times that they're seeing is a lot of it's predicated on somebody else, right?
Right. Right.
And then even if they were to go on and have a conversation, that other part of the organization would be like, what the hell are you talking about? How do you know this, that I'm the problem?
Right.
But with data, it's very easy to say, not to say that you're the problem, but to say you're the opportunity, right? For us to improve.
Right. Right. And you can size it because you have all the facts on
You
it.
can size it.
Yeah.
You'll have, exactly.
Yeah. So we started by talking about going back to work and second half of this year and things opening up and what does that mean. One of the things that I'm also getting into with a lot of carriers is we did so much change last year or the past 18 months, whatever, so much digitization, we need a break, or we did what we need to do and now we can coast again. And I love the smile because I know you don't agree with that either. So what is it that we need to do? What's the next phase of claims transformation and digitization or otherwise? What do you see as the next thing that we're going to have to get into? Because the train has left the station. Like we don't just get to sit back now that we've done some things in the past 18 months.
There's so many angles that you can look at that question from. You know, I it's funny because there's an aspect, the first question that you asked me, which has to do with the volumes. Like we were talking about the second half of the year.
Yeah.
I didn't really address the volume component, address like supply chain, stuff like that. But I think for this question, it's also important because it's going to feel weird, right, for folks, especially some carriers were very creative. Like I think we were one of the creative carriers who we did not lay people off. We didn't do anything like that.
Yeah.
We retained our folks. We just had them working on different things, right? So we still, and sometimes they work in other parts of the organization. Sometimes they work on training or help, like you said, building out. They acted as subject matter experts to help us build out some of our digital capabilities. I think as volumes ramp up again, it's going to be an awkward shift for folks, right? It's going to feel, even if it's something that they've done before in the past in terms of the number of claims or phone calls they're getting in a day, et cetera, I think it's going to feel like pressure, at least initially, until people start to get back into the swing of things. And we're already starting to see volumes go up, in particular on the auto side as the lockdowns and everything else ease.
Yeah.
More people are moving around and traveling. I think that's gonna require some adjustment. And I think realistically getting through the summer and getting past the beginning of school, just given how many people have been working remotely and how many people have been juggling their families as well as their work.
Yeah.
That to me is a huge stress bubble over the next 4 months of just getting through that and making sure that people are mentally in a very good place. We're still going through and ahead with change initiatives, but we're trying to be very thoughtful about how do we implement those and roll those out. We've tried to actually front load more of that towards the beginning half of the year than towards the latter half of the year. We actually don't have any major deliverables from a technology perspective or otherwise in the back half of the year, with the thought that it's going to be, I think, a very stressful time. And I think this is probably going to be the case in every market as
Mm.
lockdowns lift and volumes go back up. There's going to be, I think, a lot of stress on the operations, not because they've never handled it before, what have you, but I think it's just getting back up to that pace
Yeah,
is going to be.
it's a change. Change
It's a
always brings stress. Yeah.
And if you can, I think if you can avoid major change management initiatives in the back half of the year, it's
Yeah.
probably a good idea. Or if you can't avoid it, I would say be very smart about what change initiatives you're pursuing in the back half of the year. Like I said, we've tried to front load it as much as possible, and even did some stuff like time some stuff so that the stuff that's happening on the backside that's we're delivering is happening in the second half of the year, because it doesn't people really don't see it. It doesn't
Right.
necessarily
Right.
affect the folks who are going to be interacting with customers on a regular basis.
Yeah.
um, and so we thought it was better to do it like that.
So what?
I think most
Yeah.
companies though are where they are, right? And so
Right. Right. Yeah.
like you're not going to be changing your plans based on this conversation.
Yeah, but I think I mean having an eye to the disruption that isn't created, and think generally we've been sort of like, well, we have to, and certainly the beginning of lockdowns we had major change and we had to because the lights wouldn't stay on otherwise.
Yeah.
But having some foresight and saying, what if we metered this out differently, or what if we timed it so that the things that directly impact our people and our customers are happening while there isn't, global change going on, and we do the back end stuff when people are readjusting. I think that's certainly good advice.
Yeah, I also think the future of working is also something that's something that we've been thinking about a lot. I don't have insight into what's going on with other companies except for what's publicized. I know Apple just talked about,
Yeah,
you know,
me
the
too.
Monday, Tuesday, or Thursday
Yeah,
scheduled, and the huge apparently it was a huge backlash uh, to that. People wanting more flexibility, and I've certainly heard that from my own folks in terms of having more flexibility. And I think for the health of the operation, companies should be fairly flexible, right? I think companies are fairly inflexible. They're like saying like it has to be always this. I think that's going to put a lot of strain on their operations. And I can't speak for other operation organizations in terms of what's best for them,
yeah,
um, but I think what's best for Aviva, and I think it's going to be the best or very good for other carriers, is to take a more measured approach and to really look at how effective have you been in this current environment. Has your production been good? Has the quality been good? However you measure that, whether it's through NPS or other other ways. And if it has, I think you have some room and you have some ability to take a more measured, flexible approach to how you're thinking about work post pandemic.
yeah. Um, Again, I know we're getting close on time, so maybe I could end with a question still about people. We're building off this notion of trusting them and the flexibility. Um, what's the skill set needed for claims adjusters going forward? What do you think? Have we learned that something's different in the past 18 months? The outlook on technology and customer experience, and you mentioned Amazon, like the way that the expectations from the outside are placed on us today and the nature of work is all shifted.
Yeah.
What is it that an adjuster or claims professional needs going forward? Is it different? What are the things that stand out to you?
Historically, we always focused on the technical capabilities of an adjuster. We looked at their accreditations, we looked at their work history, what types of teams have they been on. We're shifting that focus. We're looking much more towards softer skills, quite frankly,
Hmm.
because a lot of what we do is predicated on our influencing somebody else, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's influencing them to feel comfortable and, to be calm, because here to help them out. Sometimes it's influencing them through a negotiation, etc. Um, so at Aviva, we're certainly focusing a lot more on those soft skills. Can you
Yeah.
connect well? Can you present well? Can you communicate well? And if that's something that's not, and and are you personable, right? Do people want to? So that's one thing that we're putting a lot more emphasis on because we found that people who have those skill sets are typically much more versatile. Not only do they typically pick up the technical aspects just fine, right? So if they're not a technical expert, we've been training people on that when they get here. So and other companies probably have similar capabilities. I would say you'd want to make sure that you bring that to the table. You help highlight that aspect of who you are. We're also looking more and more folks who are comfortable with technology, comfortable with data. And you don't have to be an expert. We've had some folks who have statistics degrees and stuff like that who came in as adjusters. So we have people of all kinds of backgrounds, but just being comfortable with analytics and data, not necessarily being an expert, because once again, that's something that we would teach folks. We think it's good because it helps with problem solving, right?
Yeah.
And whether or not you're problem solving with math or you're problem solving with logic or what have you, um, it's something that people need to do on a regular basis. Each claim, to some degree, is a small problem. Usually, the problem is similar enough to other problems that there's a lot of consistency, but sometimes they're not, right?
Yeah.
And so having some inherent capability to say, oh, this is different. I have a structured way of approaching that to help move it along, right? I think that's absolutely critical, and being able to demonstrate that during uh, the interview process, I think, is quite important. On the technology side, we're introducing more technologies, right? We just introduced bidirectional SMS, for example, to our teams, and so now people are texting with customers. It sounds like a small thing, but you should be comfortable.
Yeah.
On a go forward path, you should be comfortable with that, like that asynchronous mode of communication. And we're looking to have more and more technology at the fingertips of our customer facing teams. So it's really important to be comfortable with the technology. The technical aspects is still important, right? Especially
Sure.
if you want to go for a senior technical role, you still need to be able to bring that. So I'm not saying that that's not important whatsoever. But for folks who are just beginning, so people who are adjusters who are just beginning, they're looking at the space for the first time. The technical is not as important to us as the other stuff because we're quite comfortable training people on the technical aspects
Yeah.
of the work.
Yeah. You need to be able to grasp it, sort of table stakes and grow it.
Yes,
But that's not enough anymore.
it's not enough anymore, and we found that when we've gravitated to just purely technical, we lose sight that there's other important things.
Yeah.
Initially, at least. Later on, you find out because you start to feel it.
Right.
Because if they're not bringing those other aspects, problems start to arise. Whether it's people problems, customer problems, relationship with broker problems. If you don't have like those, if you're not personable, if you're not good at problem solving, if you're not comfortable using data to help you get to the heart of a matter, issues will pop up along the way.
Yeah.
But if you're comfortable with that, and it's just the technical, it doesn't mean that that's not going to be an issue. But those are usually much easier to remediate, right?
Yeah.
A poor technical decision or like thinking up front, you can step in and provide some guidance. But if you ruin a relationship, it's harder to step in and
Right.
remediate that, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. Um, Brian, this is great. I think we could go on for double the time at least, because there is so much going on, and it is another really interesting moment of shift or maybe coming back together in a different
Yeah,
way for the industry. So there's a ton to talk about, but I appreciate you giving us some time, sharing your thoughts, some perspective from Aviva, the Canadian market. It's really interesting today. So thank you for this.
you bet. It's been great. Thanks a lot, Brian.